Of course. I mean, this is poppycock. Right? First of all, it looks like we have expended, according to almost all reports, virtually all of our ATACMs and prisms, 50% of our tomahawks. Then if you look at our inventory of THAADs, we've expended 80% of our THAADs and 65% of our Patriot interceptors. This is truly remarkable. And there are all sorts of reports in a variety of media outlets that Trump reamed Pete Hegseth out at a meeting this past Friday for failing to tell him that we had decimated the inventory to the levels I just described. And this just shows you that Trump is fully aware of the problem that we face. Now, he says we can replace these weapons. He's living in a dream world. We don't have that industrial base, as we were talking about before. It takes years to replace. It's going to take years to replace all these missiles. So we are in deep trouble. And this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that he did not attack this past Friday, despite the fact that he said he was going to attack. We don't have the weapons. And if you want to, you just also want to think about what attacking would look like. We would attack, it would be a massive attack, he says. And anytime you hear the word massive, that means you're going to use up a lot of missiles and a lot of bombs. And we just said we don't have a lot of missiles and we don't even have a lot of bombs, okay?
Mearsheimer opens with what may be the interview's most controversial claim. He argues that the biggest challenge facing the United States isn't simply the wars themselves. It's whether America's industrial base can replace the advanced weapons being consumed. In his view, military power depends not only on technology, but also on the ability to sustain production during a prolonged conflict.
Well, let me make a couple points about what the gentleman had to say. First of all, when he talked about the battlefield, he focused on logistics. And of course, logistics is enormously important. But I would note that the number of soldiers and the quality of soldiers that are engaged in the fight matters enormously, especially in a war of attrition. Because although territory matters, as he said, it's really the casualty exchange ratio that matters the most. And there, the size of your military and more generally, the size of your population really matters. Now, you want to remember that Russia has a population advantage somewhere between 4 to 5 to 1. Just think about that. More than 4 to 1 advantage in population size. And I would guess at this point in time, I've looked at this a bit. It's hard to come up with really hard numbers, but it looks to me like up on the front lines, the Russians have somewhere on the order of a 3 to 1 advantage in terms of manpower. And then when you hear that the Minister of Defense in Ukraine says that Ukraine has a huge problem with draft dodgers, the number he uses is 2 million draft dodgers, and they have a huge AWOL problem. This is people up on the front lines deserting to the rear. And there they estimate the number is 200,000. When you hear those numbers of draft dodgers and you hear those numbers for AWOL soldiers, and then you think about the fact that the Ukrainians are outnumbered, even if I'm wrong and it's not 3 to 1, it's 2 to 1, still 2 to 1 matters greatly. And then when you throw in the AWOL problem, the draft dodging problem, you see that just in terms of manpower up on the front line, the Ukrainians are really in deep trouble. Now, to take this a step further, there's no question that Russia has a formidable industrial base. But the fact is, not only does Ukraine not have a formidable industrial base that can pump out weapons, the Europeans and the United States do not have formidable industrial bases that can produce lots of weaponries that can match what the Russians, and by the way, I would add the Chinese, can do. So this is one of the reasons that the Ukrainian forces have been outnumbered, not only in terms of manpower, but in terms of weaponry throughout much of the war. It's a huge problem.
Mearsheimer argues that the biggest story isn't what happens in a single battle. It's the long-term balance of manpower, logistics, and industrial production. He believes those structural advantages become more important as a war drags on and ultimately determine which side can keep fighting.
And John, what is your understanding of the, you talked about several different kinds of ratios. What about, because you have to pierce through the fog of in mis and disinformation of the casualty exchange ratios, because those on the Russian side say it's like 8 or 10 to 1 against the Ukraine side. And then the Ukraine side says literally the exact opposite. Do you have any sense for what the real number is?
I'd guess that the casualty ratio is about 2 to 1. If I had to guess, I'd guess that probably about 350,000 Russian soldiers have died and 700,000+ Ukrainians have died. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainian number is even larger.
So if you take together the other numbers you talked about the manpower capabilities that Russia has, about the AWOL numbers that they have, and then the casualty exchange ratio in to the detriment of the Ukraine side, I mean, this just can't be sustained. Even forget about the logistics for the moment.
Yeah, let's just say a word about the casualty exchange ratio. I think the discourse on it in the West is ludicrous. First of all, there's no way in a war that heavily emphasizes artillery, where the Russians have had for most of the war somewhere between a 5 to 1 and a 10 to 1 advantage, that the Russians are going to be suffering much greater casualties than the Ukrainians. It just makes no sense at all. You could argue, I think, that the drones have evened things out a bit, and I think that's true. But nevertheless, artillery still matters enormously, and it certainly mattered greatly in the first few years of the war. And that has to mean that the Ukrainians suffered more deaths or more casualties than the Russians did. Furthermore, when you look at these exchanges of bodies where the Ukrainians and the Russians exchange KIAs, killed in action, soldiers, they overwhelmingly favor the Ukrainians, which is to say many more dead Ukrainians are returned by the Russians than the reverse. And that just tells you that many more Ukrainians are dying. So I would bet a good chunk of money that we will see that the Ukrainians will, in the end, have suffered many more casualties, and in particular, many more deaths than.
The discussion now turns to one of the most disputed issues in the war: casualty figures. Mearsheimer argues that battlefield conditions, artillery usage, and body exchange data lead him to believe Ukraine has suffered heavier losses than publicly acknowledged in much of the West. These estimates are his interpretation of the available information and remain disputed by Ukraine, Russia, and independent analysts. His broader argument, however, is that wars of attrition eventually reveal which side can better sustain long-term losses.
Well, let's just elevate the discussion just a bit, Danny. You're talking about Russian ballistic missiles here. The Russians hit the Ukrainians with ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and furthermore, they have a huge inventory of smart bombs, independent of these ballistic missiles and drones, a huge inventory of smart bombs that they're using very effectively up on the front lines and even in the rear areas of the Ukrainian forces. Now, let's look at the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have hardly any ballistic missiles, hardly any cruise missiles, and hardly any smart bombs that they're using against the Russians. The Ukrainians rely almost exclusively these days on drones to hit Russia. So again, just think about it. The Russians have ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, smart bombs, and drones, and the Ukrainians basically have drones. So what you see when you think about the air war is that there is a massive imbalance in the capabilities of the two sides. To add to that, there is no question that the Russians have done a huge amount of damage inside of Ukraine. With all that weaponry that they have, that's hardly surprising. But you've seen no evidence that the Ukrainians have been willing to throw up their hands and surrender. So why does anybody think that hitting Russia with drones alone is going to cause the Russians to throw up their hands and surrender? I just don't understand what the logic is there. This war is going to be settled on the battlefield, as you and I have talked about before. Now, logistics does matter. And let's go back to the logistics point. And there, if you look at what the Russians are doing with all that air power that I described, they're tearing apart the transportation network. They're going after gas stations in eastern Ukraine. And furthermore, they have basically shut down Ukraine's ports on the Black Sea. And most importantly, this is the Odessa ports. And that means that Ukraine is basically a landlocked country at this point in time. This is going to have devastating economic consequences. Plus, it's now very difficult for Ukraine to import weaponry into the country via the Black Sea, via the Odessa ports. And furthermore, those weapons that do get in have to travel across rail networks and road networks.
Instead of focusing on individual strikes, Mearsheimer argues that transportation networks, supply lines, and infrastructure are the real targets in modern warfare. In his assessment, disrupting logistics weakens an opponent far more effectively than symbolic.
Apparently, there were about 13,000 targets that we went after. Iran is a target-rich environment, fighting a massive war over a protracted period of time when you don't have many weapons to begin with. I want to know how that one works.
Yeah, in fact, that was underscored in this recent interview with a guy named Colonel Hamilton, who was talking about the Patriots. Now, in the first part of this clip, I'll just kind of give you a trigger warning. He's going to make some claims about what these weapons can do and how effective they actually are. But then in the second part of it, it's going to get a little bit more real.
The Patriot really is the only system made in large numbers that has the capability to knock down Russian ballistic missiles effectively at high rates. And then secondly, our European partners and allies, some of them have the Patriot, but they have even fewer remaining than the U.S. does because they have given so many to Ukraine in the early years of the war. Is that the U.S. has expended so many Patriot missiles in the Gulf War, in the war against Iran. The numbers I'm seeing are from about 2,330 before the war, we're down to about 800 right now. So we've expended almost 2/3 of our Patriots. We don't have them to give because we need them. The U.S. has got to preserve them for other theaters, for the Middle East, for the Indo-Pacific, as well as for Europe. So therefore, we've even been diverting missiles that our European partners and allies had bought and paid for to restock U.S. supplies.
So you see there, number one, he claims they're really effective, and all evidence says that they're barely effective. But anyway, he does point out that globally, it's not just what's happening in the Middle East. It's not even just what's happening in the European theater of operations. But globally, we're running out of them. What possible rationale would you have for President Trump to go back in, to listen to these generals like General Kellogg, General Keane, et cetera, go back in and, quote, finish the job when the only job we might finish is running out of what little we have?
Well, I'm not sure at this point in time that he's listening to Keane or to Pete Hegseth, for that matter, or to Keith Kellogg. I think at this point in time, President Trump understands what's going on. You know, Danny, I noticed the other day that there's talk now in the Pentagon about placing greater emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons for dealing with Russia and China. As soon as I read the stories making that point clear, I said, this is probably because we've expended so many conventional weapons that we feel that our conventional deterrence in East Asia and in Europe has diminished to the point where we have to rebalance the deterrence equation and put much more emphasis on nuclear deterrence. So that's why I think they're now talking about using tactical nuclear weapons, all which just shows you how much trouble we're in.
Building on his earlier argument, Mearsheimer says the issue isn't only how many weapons are available today, it's how quickly they can be replaced. He argues that industrial limitations could affect future military planning and force difficult strategic choices if conflicts continue.
Well, let me make two sets of points. The first is that I think what's going to happen here is that the United States, after the Ukraine war, after the shooting stops in the Ukraine war, and after there's some sort of settlement in the Iran war, will focus laser-like on East Asia. I think the situation is analogous to what happened during the Vietnam War. When the Vietnam War ended in roughly 1975, I mean, for us, it was early 1973 when we were basically out. But then Saigon fell in April of 1975. So it really kind of ended in the 73-75 period. Most viewers won't remember this because they're not old enough. But what we did was we focused laser-like on Europe. We paid enormous amounts of attention to Europe after 1975. And the last thing we ever wanted to think about was getting involved in another war like Vietnam. Let's stay out of what we then called the Third World. No more wars in what we then called the Third World. I think once this war with Iran is over with, we're going to greatly reduce our presence in the Middle East. And as I said before, I think Trump is trying to significantly reduce America's military footprint in Europe. And I think what we will do is we will pivot to Asia. That's point number one. Point number two is the question whether you think the fact that we got defeated in the Gulf means that the Chinese will think that we're a paper tiger. And I don't think that's the case. This is not to say that the Chinese think that we are Godzilla and we are unbeatable. But the fact that we lost in Vietnam did not lead the Soviets to think that we were a paper tiger. And I think the same basic logic will apply here. And I think if I'm right and that we do pivot to Asia in a meaningful way, we will build the defenses up and we will make it clear to the Chinese that despite the fact that we lost, that we suffered a humiliating defeat in Iran, in the war against Iran, that they should not think that we are a paper tiger.
Mearsheimer ends by looking beyond today's conflicts. He argues that once the current wars subside, the United States is likely to shift greater strategic attention toward Asia. His warning is that decisions made now could influence the global balance of power for decades. Throughout this interview, Professor John Mearsheimer returns to one central idea. Wars are not won by headlines or political messaging alone. In his view, they're decided by logistics, industrial capacity, manpower, and long-term strategy. Whether his predictions ultimately prove correct or not, the questions he raises about military readiness and global competition are likely to remain at the center of international debate for years to come.